Good morning and welcome to this, the second in our series of cybersecurity webinars from Nostra. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Gary Byrne. I am the Managed Services Director here at Nostra. I want to thank you all for joining us today, both attendees from our last webinar and also people who are joining us for the first time. For anyone who couldn't make the last webinar, it is available on the Nostra YouTube channel, and we will share a link to that channel in a follow-up email after this webinar. The last time we talked about Nostra's multi-layered approach to cybersecurity and how AI has increased the volume, intensity, and sophistication of cyber attacks to unprecedented levels. We also talked about the helpful guidelines that are available these days in terms of policies and frameworks that can greatly protect you and your customers' data. We will be looking a lot closer at these policies and frameworks throughout this series of webinars. Each webinar is going to focus on a specific area of security and compliance, and today's session is going to focus on the area of security awareness training and why it's critical in the battle against cyber attack. I did mention last time that the sessions are best when interactive, so please, any questions you have, there's a chat, there's a Q&A, just post your questions there and we will handle them for you. We will also leave time at the end of the session specifically to deal with Q&A. As always, the sessions will be recorded and we will send on both the recordings and the slides to each of the attendees afterwards. So now I'd like to welcome you again, and I'd like to, at this point, hand over to our Security and Compliance Advisor, Tom Bambrick, who's going to take us through today's webinar. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Gary. Morning, all. We'll kick straight into it. We have a lot to cover in the next 30 to 45 minutes. So what will I cover in that period of time? First of all, I want to have a quick look at what an IT architecture is about and why it needs to exist. So we'll cover that off in the first few slides, but that will be the least amount of time we'll spend this morning, because we want to spend most of our time on practical advice for you as a user of IT and maybe some of you who manage IT, some of the things that can be done to help protect your IT infrastructure and ultimately your business. So what is an ICT architecture? Why is it there? And why is it important? Essentially, down through the years, IT architecture or ICT architectures were built in one of two ways. There may be a middle road, but generally speaking, a lot of them in the early days were built on the right-hand side of this slide. It was makepiece, things strung together and made to work, rather than a structured design approach where you used enterprise architects, technical architects, network architects, application architects to actually design the infrastructure and make sure that it all sits together, which is the wall on the left-hand side. Everything's neat, tied together, not necessarily of the same block size, but it's structured in its approach. And why did we do that? We did that as IT people, or people managing or responsible for IT. We did that because we ultimately accepted that if we got it wrong, we affected the business. We affected the efficiency or the effectiveness of how the business operated, whether it was the bottom line in terms of their income and revenues, or whether it was simply a failure to deliver the service that we were designed to deliver to our clients and customers. Within that design is security. It was always there, but generally an afterthought. But security was always there, and companies generally invested some money in security. In this whimsical slide, you'll see where one organization has invested millions in their cybersecurity program and strategies. 5 years ago, they implemented a multi-factor authentication system. Over that 5-year period, they never touched it. They sat complacent, thinking they'd done their job. They put in an MFA. They never updated it. They never reviewed it as part of ongoing increase or changes in the top level of that structured diagram. And as a result, it now becomes the weakness. What we're trying to say here is, once you've designed your architecture based on the diagram, the wall on the left-hand side, it's a continuous process. It never stops. And typically any change to the infrastructure, the architecture, needs to be reviewed. And we typically do that through things like change management processes. I sat down one evening, wet evening, I remember, not a lot on TV, and I said I would brainstorm governance and cybersecurity, and this is what I eventually stopped and came up with. There's more you could add, but it was getting late and I needed to go to bed, so I stopped at that point and finished the slide. But it is a massive area when you look at it. Just this slide alone is very busy. If I was to talk about this slide alone, it would be a morning session in itself, or if any of our guys were to talk about this, we'd be here for the morning. But the top left one I deliberately put up there because that's what we're talking about today. The biggest risk to IT is actually users. It's an acceptable high risk when it comes to cybersecurity risks. And therefore, you need to address that risk as an organization. No one can do it for you. And this training today is part of how you address that. And other things we do, which you will see through this morning, are things we do, as Gary mentioned in the last session. It's this multi-layered approach to securing the information that's stored within our organization. It's not the infrastructure, it's the information that's stored within that infrastructure we're keen to secure. Just to give an example of how complex this is a diagram I did as a result of a piece of EU legislation that came out on the 25th of January of this year, known as DORA. It was a diagram I put together to show senior members of organizations and companies and board members of organization and companies how complex what the requirements of DORA are in terms of understanding how you deliver services to your customer and clients. I'm not going to go through it. I just threw it up there to show you the type of work that a technical architect or an enterprise architect, I held that glorious title a number of years ago myself. This is what I was doing, sitting down, doing these mind maps, drawing diagrams, network diagrams, data flow diagrams to show where everything's strung together. We did exercises similar to this using brainstorming techniques to map out single points of failure within the diagram you're seeing in front of us. And I was delighted to see that a lot of the legislations coming out today have brought back the concept of single point of failure exercises because it had got lost over the last few years. Next, the rise in cybersecurity and why it's become so topical. In my early days in IT in the early 90s, this slide deck was 2 slides. It took me 5 minutes. This shortened version of my full slide deck is 27 slides. That alone tells you how much change has occurred and how much effort we need to put into training people. So why has the risks increased? There are 3 key areas. There are others, but there are 3 key areas we'll cover today. There's what we connect to our network. Again, back in the 90s, IBM mainframes, other mainframes and mini systems were out there. Typically, the network comprised dumb terminals hanging off of those type of systems. We introduced PCs and Macs, and we started to connect them into our network. We started to move the processing power centralized on our mainframes and mini-frames, and we moved it out, which also meant we lost control of those applications and we lost control of the data that sat in them. Next in the line was wireless networking. We introduced wireless networking, the ability now for other devices that couldn't be plugged into a network to connect onto our corporate networks. And we started to connect tablets, laptops. We started to connect business or building management systems, security camera systems, right down to the day we're connecting fridges and all sorts of weird stuff. I've actually seen scans of business networks with fridges being identified and picked up on the corporate network. So the devices were connected as extended and a range of devices. And all of these devices are not necessarily manageable from a central IT perspective. If it's got an operating system and we can attach to it and install security product solutions on them, great. But if we can't, then we have to think about how we're going to isolate and secure those. The next is how we hack. My first training course in hacking was in 1992. At that course, I received a raft of hacking tools, which we were to use for ethical hacking rather than hacking for other reasons. And the only other method was to go to the web and download them. And typically, if you went that route and downloaded something from the internet, then you ran the risk of the hacker using the tool on your device to perform their hacking. So there are risks associated with it. But today, we see crimeware as a service. The same type of service you see with the likes of Microsoft Office 365, your email, SharePoint, your OneDrives. Same service exists. You can sign up, you can rent, and you can use these hacking tools with minimum knowledge of IT. And you can start a phishing campaign that leads to a ransomware demand. When we look at it, what is being done has changed. In the early days, again, it was script kiddies, guys sitting in the corner of a room, a bedroom, garage with their computer, hacking, trying to hack somebody. If they got in, they just did mischief, typically. They rarely did more than just a bit of mischief. There might have been a bit of business espionage going on, but that was the limit of the early hacking type activities. That's all changed. We've now moved over to the theft of data, the sale of that data, the ransoming of access to data on a corporate network through ransomware attacks. So it's moved. So we've now seen the script kiddies become the lesser risk to criminal activity and global type criminal activity, not just localized criminal activity as happened early on. We're now seeing organized crime around the theft of data and the encryption and prevention and the ransoming of access to data within an organization. We're seeing hacktivists move from their traditional protesting and whatnot outside a corporation or business that they believe is doing harm in some way to us. Where hacktivists, those same activists have moved to the internet and they're using hacking techniques to attack organization. And I'm sure I don't have to tell you about the increase of state use in hacking type activities. Frameworks are legislation such as NIS2, not to confuse it with NIST2, which Gary, I'm sure, will talk on a later date about. That is there designed to enforce the same type of standards at a state level and any organization that deals with a state entity. So how do we protect ourselves? So we'll move now into the real piece, the advice we can give you. The multi-layer approach, as Gary said, is key to this, and that's what we're really going to go through from your perspective here now. At a top level, the concept of zero trust has become very popular, and I'm sure some of you have heard about it at this stage. Zero trust essentially says you never trust anything, and you'll see where we talk about that later on. You always verify what you're doing. Never trust, always verify. So the first layer is your computer. You've got a computer. When I say computer, it could be a laptop, it could be a PC, it could be a phone, it could be a tablet. It's any device where you can store data and perform actions upon that data is the best way to describe it. You must ensure the operating system and applications on that device are up to date. You'll see later on when it comes to application, only use approved applications within your business. Don't start installing stuff yourselves, whether you have the permission to do so or not, but ideally you shouldn't have that permissions. Organizations should have a standards document that clearly state what is acceptable applications and what are non-acceptable applications. Ensure you log off at least a day. When it comes to systems and securing that device, we typically push them down from a central service or server service. If you're not logging off and restarting your device, those settings, updated settings, and some of them could be urgent, are not being applied to your device. So if it's 3 months ago and we've applied 3 different setting changes in that 3 minutes to help us secure your device from a new known threat, you're out of date and presenting a risk. And it's not a risk to you, it's a risk to the organization. And obviously, if you're doing restarts of your device on a regular basis, it does improve the performance of your machine and it does sort out lingering issues. So there's a benefit to you as a user of the device as well. Username and passwords, complex passwords. What we mean by the term complex password, we talk about length. Typically, it's recommended today that the length is between 12 and 16. Most of us opt in the middle for around 14. And that is particularly true of external systems, web-based systems or internet-based systems, minimum of 12 to 16. Usually most will opt for the 14. The composition of that password should contain uppercase, lowercase, numbers and characters, such as hash, question marks, so on and so forth. I always avoid dollar signs and pound signs and euro signs, simply because if somebody's misconfigured your keyboard, they don't necessarily appear in the place you think they're going to be. So typically I leave them out. But that's your composition. Because of the length, the industry now is generally recommending you move to passphrases, which is simply a phrase rather than a word like we typically used before, or something that looks like a word. Is a phrase we make up and we use that to access the system. But the same length and composition, complex rules that apply to password should apply to the use of the passphrase. I have heard people say you don't need to put in the complexity, but I still believe adding some form of complexity using the complexity rules. At the end of the day, passwords are hacked by using brute force password attacks, which are also known as dictionary attacks. I'm sure even by now somebody has created dictionaries to do the exact same to attack passphrases. So good to add in that complexity rules. Sensitive data, use different passwords where you're entering any form of sensitive data or storing. So payroll system, HR systems, accounting system, finance systems, customer information systems, your logon to Office 365, they should all be unique passwords. It shouldn't be the same password. The only exception to that is where you're using a password manager, which gets around the keeping it safe we talk about later on. Use two-factor, particularly on any external or internet-facing service. That's either two-factor or multi-factor. What is two-factor and what is multi-factor? It's something you know, like a password, including your security questions, something you have like the Microsoft Authentication or Google Authentication app, and something you are. So it's your fingerprint, your face, facial recognition. QFA is using 2 of those. MFA is using 2 or more, or 3 or more. Change the password regularly. This has come up for debate. I even saw an article from Microsoft suggesting to dump passwords. There's no need to change passwords anymore. I've seen a retraction on that, not necessarily by Microsoft, but within the industry as a whole. And they're now suggesting, although you don't need to change it as often as you used to, you should still change your password on a reasonably regular basis. Never use personal passwords for work. If your password is going to get hacked, it's likely to be your password to one of your social media systems like LinkedIn, Facebook. LinkedIn has been hacked twice, for instance. If you're using the same password to access your financial system at work, the hacker will research once they know that password, and they will use your work email address to attempt to hack other systems that you're using at work. Keep it safe. We've touched on that by using things like password managers, and don't share them with any. When you're given a username and password, you're accountable and responsible for the use of that. When you share it with somebody else, you Delegate the responsibility, but you cannot delegate the accountability. If that person uses your account for illicit purposes, you are still accountable. And if it's a legal infringement that occurred, you can be subject to the same outcomes as the person who performed the act in the first place, because you're always accountable. And for that reason alone, you should never. Besides that, within the organization, they may need to do tracing and tracking of what actually went on and be required to do that for any number of reasons. Shoulder surfing, that's gone beyond what we typically knew. The person standing nearby you, watching you type in your ATM code or your password on your laptop or your phone PIN code as you're sitting in the airport. That's moved beyond that, because now with the use of cameras on these lovely phone devices, they can be a distance away and they can now zoom in and watch you. And not just watch you put in those, they can watch you put in your banking account details. So the general advice is, don't be doing that type of thing in a very public area like an airport. If you're going to do it, you've got to make sure it's secure. There are privacy screens for laptops to help, but then obviously the general rules of covering or trying to hide what you're typing when it comes to password apply. Viruses and malware. Keep the antivirus tool or endpoint protection tool on your system up to date. Typically for most corporate users, particularly if you're using a provider like Nostra, that's managed for you. But at the end of the day, things can go wrong. Your system may have been attacked by a hacker who disables it. You may receive a pop-up from your machine saying your antivirus software is disabled. So you need to keep some idea. You need to watch for any messages that are coming from your machine or your antivirus software telling you that something's gone wrong. You are not up to date, for instance, for some reason or another, and therefore report it. I have a list of some of the viruses and malware known types out there. I'm not going to go through them because of the amount of time we have available to us today. So moving on to email, the next layer of defense. How do we protect ourselves from phishing and whaling attacks? Phishing is a generic attack. It's not designed to attack anybody. It's usually an email drop by the hacker to email addresses that bought from somewhere or got from somewhere on the internet. A whaling attack is slightly different. This is a concerted effort, and I'm going to give you an example of that later on, so I'll cover that off in more detail. So how do we protect ourselves? There are things as an IT organization or an organization can do at a higher level. They can secure and make sure that my email address in Nostra cannot be spoofed by somebody else. Now I can show you, I'm going to show you later on how somebody can overcome that, even if I've done SPF and DMARC. So the fact that you've put these in place doesn't mean you can sit back and say, hey, if something comes in from Nostra.ie, at Nostra.ie, I'm safe. We'll see later on how that can be overcome as well. Review where you're publishing your email address. Don't give it out nilly-willy. Don't use it to sign up to personal stuff. Don't use your business email address to sign up personal stuff. Think about who you're giving it to, even if you're signing up for a business service. If you are worried about being compromised or have never done it, we've given you a link to a site where you can go in, put in your email address. You can even put in phone numbers now at this stage, and you can check if these have ever been compromised in any way, right down to being told exactly what was compromised to give you a feel for what you need to do next. Spotting and reporting, train your staff, as we're trying to do here today, understand phishing, as we're going to do here today, and how it is used. And as an organization, operate a no blame culture. If somebody comes in and says, I've done something, I've done X and compromised the system, or may have compromised the system, reward them. Don't blame them. That is the accepted way to deal with it when it comes to cybersecurity reporting, and the recommended way. I've even seen where some organizations now are starting to reward staff if they come in and report them. Not too sure if that's a good idea. Open for debate. Protect your systems, passwords, username, 2FA and MFA, we've covered already. Use a good mail and web filtering. These are like your antivirus software. that we talked about earlier. This time we're going to perform the exact same checking on all emails and web browsing that's occurring within our organization in an attempt to prevent hackers from using those mediums to attack you because you've got a secure emails or a secure device using a malware tool. And again, your fallback if things go wrong, you've had a ransomware attack, is your backups. Have a good backup strategy in place and plan and procedure in place, and make sure one of those backups cannot be attacked by the hackers, particularly the likes of ransomware. Incident management, have a plan, have a documented way of dealing with them, have a procedure on how you track and log them, and ensure that people feel comfortable reporting when they need to report, even if they're just suspicious they've done something wrong. From a personal perspective, your personal incident response plan is, if I think something's gone wrong with my device, I disconnect from the network, switch off wireless networking, unplug the network cable, and preferably shut down the device as soon as you can. But get it off the network. Some of these viruses, like you'll see in the previous slide, a worm virus, will spread rapidly across a network. Back about 10 years ago, there was a virus that spread so rapidly, most IT organizations couldn't find time to react to it, and major hospitals were actually brought off the air as a result of the network attack that was performed. Phishing emails. Let's deal with phishing emails. How do I avoid the risk? When we talk about phishing emails or any cybersecurity, dealing with any potential cybersecurity threat, we talk about red flags. It's not just one red flag, it's a build-up of these red flags that should lead you to say, I'm not going to touch that email. I'm going to delete it and make sure it's gone from my deleted items folder within my email system. So the first thing we deal with is the sender. I'm going to touch on this again. You cannot trust the from box on an email system. And you'll see why later on I make that statement so boldly. I'm not saying there are exceptions. You cannot trust. You must verify who they are. You can't trust the name, and you can't necessarily trust the email address that's there. So how do you deal with it? Email comes in, you ask yourself a couple of few questions. First of all, you look at the email address. Is it coming from a business email address? If it's coming from Gmail or Outlook.com, a non-business email address, and it's a business-related email, why? So your red flag. Are you expecting something from this person today? Are you expecting something from this person with that type of topic in it? Red flag. Email arrives from a sender and it's unexpected. You're not expecting this. There's no reason why you should suddenly be getting this out of the blue. It's another red flag. The date and time is unusual. Middle of the night and you've got an email. Now, marketing departments will use that, or companies will use that to do bulk emailing. But it may also indicate that this email has come from a time zone, not yours. So the time when it comes across to you appears as the early hours of the morning. Where are you in it? You're in the CC field. Why? The email has been addressed to you. It's Dear Tom, but I see tom.bambrick@nostra.ie in the CC field. Or better still, I don't see it at all because it's put into the BCC field. Another red flag. The subject line. Is the email showing that it was forwarded? FW in Outlook comes up when it's forwarded. Is it a reply to an email that you never sent in the first place? Is it relevant to your job role and what you do on a day-to-day basis? Typically, a lot of these are a templated email that are sent out in the first wave of attack, and then they're forwarded for the next wave of attack, and that's where the forwarded tag comes in. Check the salutation. It's addressed to you. It's to me, to Tom, but it says Dear Customer. Doesn't add up. Again, another red flag. And get to know the signature, particularly of people you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and have a quick look at them and make sure they stack up to what you've seen before. Most signatures are added now centrally by email systems, so it'd be very rare for an email to come in from somebody you deal with on a day-to-day basis that would be missing a signature. Phishing emails by red flag. Grammar and spelling, still there. Some of these are crafted or drafted in a language other than the language you use, and they will be translated using translators, which don't always do a good job. So the grammar and spelling is still one to look out for. Content makes you feel uncomfortable. So you look at the email and your gut reaction is, I don't like the look of it. If you get that, you should now prove it's genuine. You're not proving that it's not genuine. You're proving it's genuine. You've moved your stance. There's an urgency to act. Pay this immediately. Your password has been hacked. Click and that. There's this urgency built into it. Links within the email. Links don't always necessarily stand out, as you will see in the example I give later on. But if you want to check if there's a link in an email, or you want to check the exact link that's clearly defined in an email, keep your fingers away from the mouse buttons, move the mouse over where you think the link is, and the actual URL will pop up. And that will allow you to check it and check if it's a good link or not. And again, later on, you're going to see how that's been made difficult with some of the techniques being used by hackers today. But typically what you might see is Nostra 1246 hash.ie is the actual URL, part of the URL, which wouldn't be an address a business would use in the first place. So it's an indicator that there's something wrong here. But if it doesn't look right, be quite honest, my advice today is anywhere you get links, don't click on them. Okay, if you get a link saying click on this to view your latest payment that was made yesterday on your Amazon account or your PayPal account or Revolut account, go and log in to Revolut or Amazon, do your normal bookmark for that site and check it that way. Don't click on the links. Avoid clicking on links at all costs. Attachments, no such thing as a safe attachment anymore. They can fool you in many ways to make sure there's embedded code within it. They can even present an icon for Microsoft Word when it's not a Microsoft Word document. Too good to be true, they're offering you some sort of free incentive to do something. Another major red flag. And most of these guidelines will apply to text, instant messaging, social media, you name it. If they can get it into you, they will use it to get it into you. That's a sample. You'll see there, watch for URL links. They put links in the header of a table on the hope that you might do something silly like click on them to sort them, as you typically can do in a table these days. And by doing that, you actually activate a hidden link. Usually it'll be a slightly different color, as you can see here. But again, that's not going to be obvious necessarily. CEO or senior exec fraud, a whaling example. This is more structured and a lot more effort. So this is criminal activity, essentially, we're looking at here. Hack begins. 5 steps. Hack begins. First of all, they check how secure is your email domain. Can I spoof it? Can I spoof Gary.Burns' email address in Nostra? They will see if they can do that. If they don't, they'll still carry on and just spoof the name and use something I'll show you later on to actually fool you. They'll research senior people. They'll research the organization. They'll identify the CEO, the managing director, who's head of finance, who's head of payroll, who's head of anything that involves them getting something from you. They will research who would do this type of work. So they'll research your payroll staff. They'll research your account staff, who's in accounts receivables and payables, and usually accounts payable. They will search that and identify them. They'll even go so far as to try and follow them on social media to identify a weak link. Somebody who is overly active on social media presents things that are not necessarily wise. They're likely to be susceptible to what we know as social engineering. And I'll talk about that shortly. monitoring the CEO or senior exec's social media accounts, they may be able to identify when they're not around. And that's when they'll launch the phishing campaign or the whaling campaign. In this case, they will send the email to a person they've already identified within the organization, telling them to do one of a few things. The first one may be simply to say, please pay the following supplier using these account details, because he's had to change his bank account details because his other bank has been compromised. So use only these, or just simply use only these because I'm going to save you the time looking it up. They'll give you the account details and pay X into that account, and do it, by the way, before 12 noon. And this is 11 o'clock in the day. So there'll be that urgency being emphasized in it. The other thing that may come in is simply the same email asking you to export data from an ERP system, an accounting system that tells you, or CRM system telling you to export all our customer information for the region Leinster because I want to analyze them and send them back to me. And you don't look at the email address, realizing you're actually sending them back to a hacker. So the employee acts, does what they're told. They have only less than an hour to do this, so they get on with it and they do it. The money is paid, sensitive data is linked, and as you can see, the long list is what happens next. The employee gets disciplined, the company's reputation is damaged within the industry following the data leakage or prevention of access to data. Lawsuits may flow as a result of the leaks from some of the customers affected, and some sort of legislative fine may be imposed because you failed to actually protect the systems adequately. And obviously customer trust is lost, and maybe customers are lost with it. That's an example of a CEO exec fraud. Move on to the next layer, web browsing. Search wisely and safely. Doing the Google searches are gone. These professional or organized crime activities, they're quite happy to pay the likes of Google to promote a fraudulent website. And it has been done by these type of activities. For instance, Amazon has been done a number of times, where you search for Amazon and the URL that comes up top of the list, because they've been pushed up through the techniques used by Google Ads. They've been pushed up above the normal Amazon website. You click on it, get in, and you perform whatever action to place an order, including giving them payment details across the way, or even giving them personal information, because they may ask you to verify your account or whatever, including your password and all that lovely stuff. So again, same rule applies. Avoid clicking on things. Bookmark known good sites like those and use those to access the sites. If you're using inputting sensitive information, including payment details, credit card details, and other types of payment details, only use a HTTPS. S stands for secure site. But it's not good enough just to look for the S. You also need to check the level of security on that site, depending on what you're going to do. Luckily enough, every web browser today has a padlock near the URL line. It'll be at the back or the front of the URL line. You click on the padlock and you'll get clear, concise information that tells you how safe it is to use that site. And now the little graphics on the top right of that. This is an example of how easy it is to trick you. I've given you the URL address of the Nostra website. One of them is fraudulent, but is valid. And that's the second one. If you look closely at the R, it's different than the R on the top one. The reason it's different, it's not because I've used a different font, it's because I've used a letter from the Russian alphabet that looks like an R. Now just think of the implications of that, because if you look at that as a link in a Google search or a link in an SMS message or an instant message or on an email, you are going to be fooled. There'll be very few people, I'd say, would spot the problem there. They'll just think it's an hour crafted in a different font. But extend that out when we look at phishing and the CEO exec. You now can see how I can send in an email from Gary Byrne at Nostra with a Russian letter .ie, and the likelihood is you're going to assume it's correct. So it's become very difficult to just check URLs. Mobile devices, proliferation of them, as we've already said. Need to take extra precautions, shorter screen savers and screen locking. I preferably say lock these devices. Don't rely on screensavers or those to actually lock laptops or phones. When it comes to Windows devices, the Windows key L will immediately lock a screen. On phones and tablets, just press the power button briefly and you lock the device. So do it manually. Don't rely on the timeout. Encrypt all mobile devices, whether they're a laptop, phone, tablet, USB stick, anything that stores data that's not fixed and locked down somewhere and secured within a building should be encrypted. And that includes as you move data across the network as an organization. Laptop, use Hibernate wisely. This really isn't got to do with cybersecurity. It's more got to do with the fact that you might lose documents because you can't come out of Hibernate. Take care of your device. Protective cases, don't leave them unattended in open and public areas. Keep them safe and within your view. Use locking cables if you're in an insecure area. So if I was doing this presentation in a hotel and I went for my lunch, I would typically have a locking cable with me to lock down the laptop. Bring it with you, preferably, and in a vehicle, store it hidden. And I'm not going to say store it in the boot, because I had a guy who did store it in the boot of his SUV, but he forgot to pull over the tonneau cover, and his laptop was gone within 5 minutes. Remote working, just to briefly go through it. I'm conscious of time, so I'll skip through it reasonably quickly. The bullet points are largely self-explanatory. Make sure your work area is private. People can't overhear you. I'm at home here today. I'm in a built office within my home. Door is closed, and I've set the volume so it doesn't get outside this room. That's what we mean by private, particularly when you're doing something sensitive. Only use agreed networks with your IT department. Preferably plug into a wired network. If you're using wireless network, make sure you're using a high level of encryption, which is known as WPA2 or WPA3. Definitely don't use anything that says unsecured or is using WEP. As I said, manually lock your screensavers. Reduce printing. If you print, you've got to secure. If you print, you've got to securely shred them and destroy them. It's not just good enough to tear them up and throw them in the bin. You need to use a cross-haired shredder. Keep a clean desk. Usually there's a clean desk policy in an organization. Don't allow family members or other visitors to use your workstation. Use only approved systems. Use only approved USB devices, and these should be encrypted, and apply updates when advised. Last area I want to cover is social engineering. It's a con game. It's a con game performed by people who are trained or are very good at people manipulation skills. They know how to manipulate you. They will have sufficient skills to extract your passwords. They will have sufficient skills to get you to do something that in normal circumstances you may not necessarily do. It's a manipulation of a person, essentially. And again, the manipulation can be done through several methods. I'm only really going to touch on one, which is the use of AI. This has become a major headache because we moved those phishing and whaling email attempts out to a new level, where we're now seeing invites to join a Microsoft Teams or Google Meet session with your CEO to do exactly what we saw in the whaling campaign. And when you join, the CEO is literally sitting there speaking to you using AI technologies. And I've heard instances during this type of training session where people have already experienced it. The advice is very similar to what you've seen. Unexpected, unsolicited, sounds too good to be true. They get very personal. They know a lot about you because they've done their social media monitoring of you. Be suspicious because you don't really know this person. How did they know so much about it? These guys will even follow you and even ask to become a friend. Surveys that lead to personal and sensitive information. They're dropping names like your boss's name to force you to do something. They ask you to click on a URL to verify who you are or whatever excuse they come up with. There's that urgency. It's an email again. It's an unexpected phone call. Again, when you get any of this type of stuff and you want to verify it, you go to known contact information, not anything you're provided in the phone call or the email or the social media chat. Use a good malware. We've already gone through that. And as we say, if you're worried, report it. And that's it. We come to the end, Gary.
Tom, thanks so much for that. That was really, really informative, very comprehensive, and covered a lot of areas, training on cybersecurity. I will just say, if anybody has any questions there, please put them into the chat. We have one there from Neve Codd. Tom, how can we address whaling in an organization? Is there any way to minimize the amount of whaling instances happening?
Yeah, the way I would have dealt with it myself in the past as an IT manager is I always at the bottom of an email internally. It was different from my own IT staff, and it was different to all other people in the organization. I added something into the bottom, and it was only done internal to the organization. So people in the organization, if they got an email from me, they would check to see if that line was in the email. So my line, for instance, in my last IT manager role is "Have a nice day." If that wasn't there, it didn't come from me. It was as simple as that.
I think
It is a very effective way of dealing with it in the first place, but otherwise it's applying the rules we covered in the slides.
yeah, I think a lot of people are oversharing outside the office as well in terms of LinkedIn and other places. We see a lot of information being used from LinkedIn to target organizations. That's probably one of the most ones we would see where from the outside looking in, it's very easy to see who has the primary roles in an organization, and sometimes their email addresses and contact details and everything is there. So while it's important to have some information out there, I suppose it's good to limit some of that as well.
Tom and Gary, listen, that's great advice, and as Neve said, it's great advice, so thank you so much, and thanks, Neve, for the question. One of the things which is really important is the ongoing security awareness training, and Gary, can you please talk us through, the platform Nostra uses and how we, what it is that we recommend to our customers in that regard?
Yeah, so I might get Tom to move on the slides there for me as we move. I think we've added a couple of slides. So what we have in Nostra and what a lot of our customers has is a structured training like this, but then also 10 to 15 minutes per month to keep people up to date. So what we find is doing the once-off training is good, but it's important then for the end users to actually have a small piece of training every month on the different core topics recommended by NIST that we'll see in a few seconds, just to keep people up to date. So essentially it's 10 to 15 minutes a month, a couple of questions, and then ongoing phishing tests as well, just to make sure everybody is kind of doing their training. So we find an awful lot of our companies we work with, their staff find that fairly straightforward to do. It keeps everybody up to date. I might actually, just to move on to the next slide, NIST recommend a list of core behaviors that they ask us to, or they recommend to train against, and these are those core behaviors. So what the platform will do is it'll have elements of each of these trainings. So some months we'll have a training component that will cover each of those. So phishing, password security, social engineering, malware, removable media, physical security, working remotely, mobile security, and safe web browsing. This is what's been recommended by NIST. And then we have reports then that'll do assessments across your user base then to see what they look like. One of the elements it will do is also send out a cybersecurity culture survey to everybody and see what the users believe is in place for cybersecurity, and just take some survey results back. And you can do that at the start and again at the end. It allows users notify on phishing emails that they get in, and it also does those phishing once a month or once every quarter, or whatever way you guys want to do it. We can sync up the users with 365, and then we can go through dashboards then for everybody to actually show the results for their organization. So we're finding this very good. The platform is getting better all the time, and the content is getting better all the time. This is the average report that you get to. So we're looking for trying to get people to complete about 80% of having a completion rate of 80%. This is actually one for one of our customers, pulled it yesterday. Completion rate is 95%. The on-time completion rate is 83%. And on average, their learners are spending about 150 minutes over the year doing this type of training. So it keeps everybody up to date, and we find this really works. And the reports are there to verify that it works. You see which users are clicking on emails, and the ones we do see clicking on emails are the ones that haven't done the training. So we do find this, and we can target, if somebody does click on a phishing email, then they get more training. The platform for doing this is called InfoSec, James. So this is one we've been using for the last couple of years. We've had used 2 or 3 others. So we've used Know4, we've used another platform as well, but this is the one that is way above any of the rest of them that we've been using.
And just to say, the next webinar that we will be running, we're going to have a look at Microsoft M365 security. Again, this is another critical area. That's going to be happening on the 11th of February at 11 a.m. As I mentioned at the top of the conversation, we will send on the slides and the recordings to all attendees. So once again, thank you all for attending, and good luck and enjoy the rest of your days. Take care.